I'm Paul Devine. I'm from the Department of Computer Science here in Liverpool. My presentation is a little bit skewed to the rest of today, I think, and maybe my background is a little bit skewed as well. I started agent-based modelling pretty much 20 years ago to the day as an undergraduate here at Liverpool, which makes me feel very, very old. I did my PhD here, agent-based modelling, but mostly in a biological context. Then I moved on to industry. I worked for a consultancy and we did agent-based modelling for business. And that's not like academia. You don't have to get anything past the referee. You don't wait 3 months for the referee's comments coming back. You have a client ringing you up 2 days later and saying, your numbers are rubbish and we're not interested in your error bars. So I come from a different background. I'm now back at Liverpool. I've been here a few months. I'm back doing agent-based modelling and I'm working in the field of bank liquidity. But the project is only 2 or 3 months old, really, so I don't want to talk too much about that because I'll be talking about what we hope we'll do and what we hope it'll turn out like as opposed to the reality. Okay, so I want to give you a brief overview of what agent-based modelling is to me. When I started doing it, the literature was non-existent. I've come back a few months ago and there's an awful lot of literature out there now. There's a lot of tools to support you to do it. There's a question of why to do it. Well, this has already been addressed in the last presentation. The important thing is the individual level, and the stuff we observe around us in the world and in society, that's actually emerging from much lower scale interactions between people, between organisations. So that's what the interest is in doing agent-based modelling. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you do it, but rather talk in the abstract, I'll tie it in with the project I did a while ago with the team predicting movie box office in the US. So I'll talk about what the problem was and how we went through the process to do that, because it gives you an idea of how you would go about using agent-based modelling and incorporating what then, 10 years ago, was really live data, but that was the age of small data and proprietary data. Okay, it's a simulation approach. You produce an executable simulation you're going to run on a computer. It's built from the bottom up, as we say, the individual is the important thing, and the whole system behaviour emerges from fundamental features, fundamental interactions. An agent in this instance would be an autonomous software entity, which sounds quite complex, but they might in fact be very, very simple. One of the important things about your agents is that they're heterogeneous. The world isn't made up of lots and lots of things that are all the same. The world is made up of lots and lots of things that can be very, very different. So even if your agents are just representing people, and you say, well, they're all the same, aren't they? Of course they're not. And it's those differences that actually drive the system behaviour. That's something you can capture in agent-based modelling. Okay? And these agents have relationships to each other. They interact, they affect each other, information flows between them, behaviours running between agents will affect the states of different agents. One of the very earliest agent-based models produced was by a guy called Craig Reynolds, who about 20 years ago produced a little model of flocking birds, and this was the whole idea of emergent behaviour. So he had a lot of very, very simple agents representing the birds. And there was only local interactions, and they behaved according to what the birds immediately around them were doing. But from these very, very simple local interactions and behaviours, the whole flocking behaviour emerged. So you can imagine if you are encapsulating more complex behaviours in your agents, and that was actually a homogeneous set of agents, but in a more heterogeneous set of agents, it gives you the opportunity to model much more complicated features. Okay, as I've said, why do you want to do this? Well, real systems are very complex. The world around us is very complex, comprised of many interacting entities, ideally suited to the agent-based approach. Individual differences are also very important. Now, I started off doing biological stuff. Now, if you're interested in population dynamics, the individual differences between the members of your population can have a big effect on how your population behaves. You can't just say, I've got population P, I'll do this with this. And if you're interested in evolution, which was where I was doing my work, then individual difference is actually the driving force of evolution individual difference and heritability. So if you're going to model that, you need a way of representing it. And that's what agent-based models gave us. The other thing about agent-based models is that all models are just perspectives on the world. They give you a particular view of the world. And for centuries we've been producing analytical and mathematical models, and an agent-based model just gives you a different way of looking at it. You come across zealots who say we need to do agent-based modelling, especially for the economy, because the old models don't work. I'm not quite that zealous about it, but I think agent-based models can give you a different perspective, especially the extremes of system behaviour. What can an agent represent? It could be an animal, it could be a person, it could be an organisation, a country. Obviously, we're doing some bank modelling, so the agents are things like banks, the central bank, other financial institutions, non-bank institutions. There's a very large European-wide simulation called EURACE, which has been written, and the agents there go down to the household level. They don't even go down as far as people, it's just the household level. So the agents are banks, central banks, companies, households. So I hope I'm explaining myself sufficiently well here. Okay, so I wanted to go very, very quickly through how we might go about building a model, and now I'll go back to it, and I'll do it in the context of how we built what was called Moviescape, which was a box office prediction model for the US movie market. Now, I don't have the luxury of coming to agent-based modelling as a domain expert, so I'm not a domain expert who's looking to use agent-based modelling as a tool. I've always gone in as an agent-based modeler who knows very little about the domain. So for me, the big thing is getting domain expertise. That's generally as a consultant, that's the people who hire you. But they tend to have a limited perspective as well, so you have to broaden your horizon beyond those people. Data analysis, everybody's got data. You want to know how these systems behaved in the past. You want to know what's available to you in order to primary model. And after you've gone through talking to everybody and reading all the literature and trawling through all the data, very often there are holes, the things you really want to know in order to build your model. So you want to do a little bit of model investigation. So that's all about understanding the target system. Now, then you build a model, which is really simple. That's the bit that takes you an awful long time, and you often find yourself going round in a loop in order to get that even vaguely sensible. Then you get a chance to run and analyse your model. Now you can pipe data into it. At this point you find out what mistakes you've been making, and you wind it back at the start, asking more questions. And eventually, if it works properly, you get an output. If you're an academic, you'll start writing papers, hope to get it past the reviewers. If you're a consultant, you'll send the figures off to your client and they'll ring you up on Monday morning and tell you your figures were rubbish, which used to happen to us occasionally. Okay, so looking at this approach and applying it to the movie market, this wasn't just me, there was a team of about 10 of us working on this, and we were approached by a movie studio, and they want to be able to forecast movie box office every weekend in the US for all the films across the whole market. What they wanted was a 10-week rolling forecast, because as a movie executive you have a portfolio of films that you're releasing into a competitive marketplace, because your competitors are also releasing films. It's not really a zero-sum game, because you can increase the total audience, but generally if somebody's getting a lot of box office, you're losing. Now, their previous approach was about 30% accurate, which really wasn't very good. They thought they'd reached the limit with that, and our pitch to them was it's the social aspects of movie going that you need to get into the model. So if we go back, see if I can find backspace. Okay, the experts in this case were the movie executives and the marketing executives, the people who'd worked in the industry for a long time. They collected a lot of data, and the way they did their predictions at that point was they'd run surveys every week, telephone surveys where they'd phone people up, ask them a series of questions, and then they'd plug that into their model together with some other data like their advertising spend and such like, and they'd get predictions what box office was going to be doing. Now, as an executive, you want accurate predictions, because if you want to know if 10 weeks out a film you're expecting to do really well is actually showing very low numbers, because you might want to modify your promotional approach. If you're releasing a film that you're not expecting to do big numbers, 10 weeks out you see it's potentially going to do big numbers, then you want to be able to take measures in order to ensure that everybody who wants to see that film is going to be able to see it, to increase the number of screenings, maybe the number of prints if you can do that. And of course, I think the big thing for the person we worked for was that knowledge is power, and that person, once we were doing the work, had better predictions than anybody else in the studio, and that gave them power in meetings, made them look as if they were really in charge of things. And that was a very, very important point, though it wasn't actually explicit. Okay, so talk to the executives, analyse some of their data, and we found out we needed to do some novel investigation, because in talking to people, we couldn't get a clear view of how us, because we're all in the movie-going population, so we're actually modelling us here. We couldn't get a clear view of how those decisions were made about what movie you go to see at the weekend. And also, when we analysed their data, we noticed there were some features in the data that they were ignoring that tended to be very, very good predictors of what was going to be successful and what wasn't going to be successful. So our novel investigation, when I say ours, we actually hired an external consultancy to do this, the wife of one of my colleagues, to be more accurate, who was a psychologist. They conducted some investigation into movie-going behaviour. Now, we know going to the movies or films, it's actually a social activity, which is strange for something where you sit down in the dark and don't speak to anybody. But you go with friends, or you go in groups. And in order to make a model that was executable, because this was 10 years or so ago, and computers were a lot smaller, even though we had a really powerful one, you need a way of simplifying this in order to get something tractable, so you can do a prediction every week. And you need to do multiple runs, and your problem doing your PhD and my problem doing my PhD is I have to leave the computer running all weekend to get anything remotely useful out of it. So part of the modelling was to capture behaviour, but to be able to distill it down into a simple and executable form. So we structured people's social movie-going by assuming and putting into the model, and this was generated by the research, that people go to movies in 4 modes. They go on their own. Not really many people go on their own. It's vanishingly small, except in places like New York, where a lot of people go on their own. But that's not enough to really skew any results. They go as couples, they go as family units, and they go as groups of friends. And we call those movie-going units. So our agents were all people, just nothing else but people in the model. And they had two social networks that overlapped and were imposed on those agents. One of those social networks was their communication network. Because if you go and see a movie, you may go because you've seen the trailer looked good, you might have read a review. One of the big influences is somebody at work saying, oh, I saw such and such yesterday, it's fantastic, or I see, I don't know, The Hobbit is opening, you know, I read Tolkien as a kid, I'd really love to go and see that. And that's what sort of brings it up in your mind as something that you might wish to go and see. And the second social network that we imposed on, or projected onto the agents, were these movie-going units, these social connections you have with people. That's actually separate but overlapping with the communication network. Because the people who influence you and you get your information from are not necessarily the people you're actually going to go to the movies with. And the other big aspect of going to the movies is effectively, on a very simple level, what the studio was doing. It did have a fairly complex survey, but it was basically ringing people up and saying, what are you going to go and see at the weekend? And somebody asks you that and you say, oh, I'll go and see The Hobbit. And so they do all their data on that basis. And the reality is, it gets to the weekend and you're going to the movie. If you go on your own, and you're in sort of 0.6% of the population, if you go on your own, you'll go and see what you want to go and see. If you go with your partner, there's a period of negotiation, because very often you might not want to see the same film. There might be a quid pro quo, where you'll see one film one week and another film the next week. My personal experience is I go and see whatever my girlfriend wants to see. It makes for a much easier life. If you go as a group of friends, that negotiation is actually a little bit more complicated. And though everybody in that group of friends might have said, I'm going to see film A, or B, or C, they might all wind up seeing D, simply because it's the one they can all agree on. Family film going tends to be driven by the children. Because if you're taking your kids to a film, you don't want to take them to a film they don't like. So this is how I actually built the model. And then putting the data into it, we commissioned our own survey. So we had this little model with what I'm afraid were only hundreds of thousands of little digital people inside, whose sole interest in life was going to the movies. Every week we'd have this survey run, the general population, so we could collate attitudes and intentions towards various movies. Then that days would have to be transformed a little bit in order to match the demographic of the general American population. So we'd use that to prime the agents, and then we'd turn the handle over and watch the numbers come out the other side. But of course you have to take a sort of Monte Carlo approach, and you run multiple simulations in order to get your numbers. When we demoed this to other clients, we were a little bit disingenuous. In fact, we were very, very disingenuous. We gave the impression, and we had a beautiful demo done on Silicon Graphics machine, and we gave the impression that you just ran this model and it gave you all your results. Very sadly, it gave us some very useful numbers that we then plugged into another regression that gave us far more accurate results than the studio originally had. So that's just a little story of how we built an agent-based model, and how we managed to get what was then live data, a weekly survey that's hardly live data. But the important thing to remember is this isn't current. This is 10 years ago or more. And if you're going to do it now, the first thing you'd think about is the delivery channels have changed. Back then it was you went to the movies, or you rented, maybe bought a video, or waited for it to come on pay TV or free-to-air TV. And that was actually quite a long period of time covering all of that. Now this has changed over the last few years, because there are now a lot of different channels of delivery, especially digital channels. You might have noticed that the time frame between a blockbuster at the cinema and it actually coming onto BBC or ITV or whatever has become really compressed compared to what it used to be. But the general principle still applies. As far as the studios are concerned, those opening days box office are the most important thing, because that's what generates the buzz for your film. And when you release the DVD a year or so down the line, it's the fact that the film was so successful in the first place is going to drive that. So that part of the model is still very valid. Now, the one thing that's missing from this, in this age of big data and social media, is Twitter and Facebook. Surely we could mine that information to get some idea of what films are trending and what's likely to be successful. If we were doing that now, we'd do that. And I do wonder that if we mine that information, we wouldn't actually be building an agent-based model. We might be giving them a number that they were happy with. And also, they're active in social media, so they're driving that agenda. Even if they're not driving it, they're influencing that agenda. The other thing about agent-based models is modelling is a very iterative thing. You don't hit it right the first time. You've got to go back and back and keep doing it. And your model fits the world as you see it, or the world as it was when you built the model. Now, things will happen. The underlying system might change, and your model will break. It won't do what it's supposed to do. Or potentially, there was something in that underlying system that you didn't come across and you didn't unearth when you were doing all your original work. Now, for our model, the thing that broke the model was Titanic. And it broke the model gradually, because from 10 weeks out to the week it was released, we were really, really accurate. The week it was released, incredibly accurate. The week after, really accurate. And then we gradually got further and further out from real box office. Now, even though you could say, but it's the first few weeks that the studio is interested in, it doesn't really matter if you're a little bit inaccurate as it goes down the line. Well, it matters a lot, because that has impact on the box office of all the other films, because you're modelling the whole system, not just one film. So if one thing is out, it has a knock-on effect. So the question now, if you're doing agent-based modelling or any form of modelling, and you get this behaviour that you haven't seen before, is what did we miss? Now, there's two aspects to this: validation and verification, which anybody who's ever written software will tell you about. Validation is it really a valid model of the system? The other one is verification, which is you've built the model, is it doing what you think it's doing, or have you made some error in your implementation? So we trawled through the implementation. We didn't see any error. There shouldn't have been an error, because if it was, it would have been systematic. And we'd missed something very fundamental in the way people go to the movies. And we had an assumption coded into our model, which is, if you saw a movie this week, you're not going to go and see it next week or the weekend after. Do we all think that's a really reasonable assumption? How many people go and see the same movie 2 or 3 weeks running? Nobody. Well, it's not the case with teenage girls in America when Titanic came out. What broke it was that groups of teenage girls were going back every week or once every 2 weeks. I don't know why. I think they just like the Art Deco recreations. Nothing to do with Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm sure. So we had to tweak the model to allow agents to go back to see a film a second time. And that was actually tested when a film called There's Something About Mary came out. And people, groups of friends, often teenage boys in this case, would go back and see that one repeatedly. And we actually captured that. So that's the dynamic process of model building. I always wondered about some of the figures that came out, because the output here was delivered by a phone call every Friday to the studio. And it's a really hard way to do modelling and give people predictions, because on Friday you're saying such and such is going to do $20 million. And the studio says, we're not happy with that figure. And you say, well, we're not determining how it's going to behave, we're just telling you how it's behaving. And on Monday, if you were wrong, they ring you up and they really let you know about it, because they're paying a lot of money for this. And one of the instances where the model was right, and it actually surprised me that it was right, is when the latest round of the Star Wars franchise came out. That was being predicted to do absolutely huge numbers at the box office. And the cinema just around the corner from my office, the Ziegfeld Cinema, they started queuing up 3 months in advance in order to see that. It was clearly going to do amazing numbers. And figures that were coming out of the model, they were good numbers, but they were way lower than anybody was expecting. And even I'm a bit of a cynic. And the client was saying, we don't like the numbers you're giving us. And even I was saying, well, why don't we just multiply the number of seats by the price of a seat and give them that number, because it's going to be a sellout. And it wasn't. The model was absolutely spot on. So, you go through a couple of years of refining these things, and you can get a pretty decent model out of it. Now, where we are with banking at the moment, we're about 2 or 3 months into the project. I was down there yesterday. At the moment, we're sort of trying to mine all that domain expertise of people in the banks and finding out what they do and why they do it. And they're not very keen on telling us. They're not very keen on giving us any of their proprietary data. The other problem with this is data analysis. There's so much data out there. Because, of course, the banking system, especially the commercial banking system, it is all just about generating numbers and shuffling them around. So, since we did our movie model, the whole data problem has become much, much bigger. And also, the question about this live data, how do we incorporate that? It's a question you might want to ask yourselves if you're doing any social simulation. Okay, I've covered that. What can I say? I'm keeping this very short. Okay? If you're actually going to build one of these things, what you need to do is decompose the system. And William of Ockham is your friend here. Because the world that you build these, because the world is very complicated. But the real problem with an agent-based model, and I fall into this trap all the time, is you need to build something simple, but you're looking at it and you're always thinking, oh, I could put this in as well, I could put that in. Really keep William of Ockham to heart, keep it as simple as possible. You want to identify your agents, whether they're animals, people, organisations, the minimum possible set, the simplest set of behaviours, the simplest set of interactions. Because when you build, you're going to build incrementally. And it's much, much easier with an agent-based model to add a different type of agent in, a different attribute to your agent, or a different form of interaction between agents than it is to try and strip something out when you have lots of dependencies. And validate and verify. And that's actually very, very hard to do with an agent-based model. And a lot of that can come down to, does it look like realistic behaviour to an expert? I built one model for Procter & Gamble, which was a model of a test market. So what they do, if they had, in this case, what they called a category-defining good, it was a new good, didn't have a category. It's not like they were producing a new washing up liquid or a new toothbrush or something like that. So they ran a 2-year test market in Columbus, Ohio, in order to assess product adoption. Very expensive to do. And what they wanted was a little test market on a computer with digital people that they could load up with different demographic profiles and then expose them to different marketing and incentive strategies and see how the behaviour unfolded. And there was very, very little data, surprisingly, for something that ran for 2 years in Columbus, Ohio. When I asked for the data, it was 2 spreadsheets on a floppy disk, which I was really pleased about because I hate trawling through lots of data. And the most important thing about building the model was what was inside the psychologists' heads who were running this test market. And the validation was at the end. They said, yes, that's very realistic for what we did in Columbus. And when you run it with the limited set of data we have for Columbus, we think that's a realistic behaviour. And we're happy to load it up with different demographics and work different scenarios through it. But that's just doing qualitative modelling. They were interested in trends, in general effects. They didn't want to know to the last dollar what something was going to do. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm rambling and let you all go and get lunch. Yeah, any questions? I'd like a question. So.